Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Korra fan commentary track video. This one's going to be for Book 4 Balance Episode 8, Remembrances. I just decided to do this one myself. I will keep in mind what you guys have picked for future commentaries as well, and continue to send in suggestions also. So yeah, to sync up your copy of the episode with this commentary track, have your DVD, Blu-ray, wherever you have the episode, ready to go at the start of this episode. I'm going to stop speaking as part of this introduction in just a little bit. There'll be about a 10-second pause, and then when I start speaking again after that pause, that's when I'll hit play, it's when you should hit play, and we should be synced up. So, bringing the introduction to an end here, after the 10-second pause, and I start speaking again, you hit play, I hit play, and we should be synced up. Okay, so here we are with K408, Remembrances. I think it's fair to say, look, this is the worst episode of Legend of Korra. It's the worst episode of both Avatar and Korra together, and I don't think there's really any debate over that. What episode of either series is worse than this? What does this episode do that makes it better than any other episode? Look, we understand it. There are reasons for why this episode is the way that it is. There was a budget cut by Nick to the show in its last season, and Mike and Brian had to make a choice between, do they basically let a bunch of the crew go early and do a full episode, or do they keep the crew on and have to do this sort of, partial animation, partial recap episode? And they obviously made the choice that was best for the crew, and we ended up with this episode. The issue I have with this episode is not that it is a clip show episode. The issue is that I don't think they execute very well on what they do here. Like, this first section with Mako actually had some potential. Like, finally, like, an opportunity for Mako to basically get a third of an episode to himself and to focus on his journey. And you just decide to make it this jokey, in-writing episode where you're just, making Mako at fault for all of the romance plot that happened in the show. And that's his thing. It's just Mako and the romance. Let's make fun of Mako for all this sort of stuff. When it's such a weird situation of, like, the writers, like, making fun effectively of their own writing of the character and kind of justifying it by making an aspect of his character, even though most fans wouldn't really agree with that idea. And it is more of an issue with the show's, like, writing rather than the character itself. So, it's cool because you do get these sort of chibi inserts, and you get, like, Wu wants to know about Mako. He's finally asking about him, and he's surprised by a lot of this stuff here. And it starts off relatively okay. And I do like the general intent of, like, Mako meeting Korra is an important thing for him. I don't like the idea that they seem to kind of, I think, overemphasize maybe the idea that, like, meeting Korra changed Mako. We'll get to that more towards the end of it in terms of the kind of conclusion that they come to with it. He was important. She was important for him to meet. And look, they're doing the direct recap thing here. They're covering the book 1 dynamic here. How they got together as a couple, the whole Asami situation, a lot of the romance drama. My issue is just that this is how the writers chose to write the plot, and in this episode, they are putting all of that, like, in-universe on Mako. And I think unnecessarily so, because it takes, to me, a lot of the agency of the girls out of it and puts it all onto Mako. That, like, Korra wasn't at fault for anything. Asami wasn't at fault for everything. It was just Mako. And there are elements like this where it's pretty much straight recap here. There's not a lot of, like, reflection going on or anything like that. And that's where, like, they could have done something here, because they seem to have, like, a good amount of time with the voice actors to do a lot of, like, good new voice acting. and I don't think they accomplish as much as they could. In that, if this was written a bit more seriously and was just a recap of like all of Mako's story, establishing like, oh, he becomes a police officer, he really finds like what he needs to do, that would have been pretty interesting. You find out that like, oh, Mako's kind of like his grandfather, but who's his grandfather? That thing of like, why did they have Mako say that like he wasn't dating Asami when he clearly was? That's just poor writing. I don't think Mako would actually say that. I think that's just very very weak writing, honestly. Especially when like Korra initiated that kiss and they're blaming him for it. And they're just leaning a little bit too much into it, of just like Wu being like, ooh, spicy romance drama. And then this is really weird that like they make fun of this as just like, was that a breakup? And then they're like, now that was a breakup when the Korra and Mako breakup happens. And it's like, what is this episode doing? What's this section of the episode doing? Like, why are you making fun of this when it was actually a pretty well done breakup? I think that like it's this weird thing where they're needlessly criticizing this and then hyping up other things. It's just, it feels a bit too gratuitous on the writer's part what they're doing here in this, and it's a little bit over the top. And then like this is just a case of like, how do you recap this? And it comes down to obviously the way they actually broke Mako and Korra up was probably one of the weakest parts of writing in terms of them, I just think, truly committing to a plot and then breaking it apart in just a weak way. And that's just a weird thing about book 2 of like, they've been together for like what, 6 months in between books, and then when they come back it's like, oh yeah, they're just at odds with each other, and let's highlight that they have a few arguments and that's why they can't ever be together as a couple, but they can have this very loyal like friendship. It's like, what are you actually doing here? And that a good breakup has to be like a screaming match ending with a breakup. And like all the time, like none of this is getting into like Mako as a character really. Like, okay, like I guess kind of being awkward with romance is kind of a thing, but like it's not his only character trait. And again, it's pretty straightforward recap here. Nothing too interesting. And obviously this is one of the weirdest things in book 2 of like, why did they decide to do that? And again, like they're trying to like retroactively explain it. It's such a weird thing that they're doing here. And again, this really awkward, like confusing situation of like Korra's memories, and then like, were Mako and Asami back together? They didn't focus on it so much after that, because like this happened so soon after that, and then they don't commit at the end to any real relationship. So like, I don't get what they're saying here. It's like the writers did and also didn't watch previous episodes correctly and interpret it the right way. Like, was he back with Asami? And then they're going to joke about it here. They were never officially back together. I think that's completely correct. I think most people are confused by what actually happened there. And then it's just like, yeah, like, oh, Mako's this disappointing character. Like, it's just like, let's bash Mako as like a 7-minute sequence in the episode. 8, actually, it's going on. This is like the longest part of the episode as well. explain that. Like, I never understood this secondary breakup here of just like, we understand that this doesn't work. Why? Because some really crazy stuff happened and you had a few arguments? Like, come on. And it's like, really? Was that part of Mako's character arc, figuring out who he was without a lady in his life? Like, really? And just they're quickly cutting through like, oh, I became a pretty important police officer. I defeated a member of the Red Lotus. These important things. Like, no, just quickly recap through that. Korra inspires him. Okay, fine. And yeah, the Korra section to me is just sort of dull. It's just by the numbers. They should have used this as Korra and Asami relationship setup, but they don't. You know, I think it's very difficult to interpret the dialogue back and forth here as being romantic. Like, okay, they're alone in the scene together, but Asami's dialogue here is so cookie cutter. It's nightmares and daydreams. It's like Aang's side of the story levels of like, you know, no, we believe in you type stuff. In that it is just Korra being negative, Asami being positive, and then Tenzin comes in and actually says something kind of interesting. It also is a little bit of a sort of like character like arc reset type thing of like Korra has made progress up to this point, but she just needs to make a final step. She's already sort of dealt with her issues with the previous villains, but it's still on her mind here. So it serves as like basically to me a literal one step back, one step forward thing. So a net, like, we don't really cover anything here. It's the most just, let's just do a recap for the sake of a recap. It's especially weirdly timed because the next episode is the key Korra character arc episode. And I don't think any of what happens in the next episode is informed by this episode. So this is a complete, like, you know, just waste of time almost. And look, it's recapping the stuff perfectly fine here. Like, they don't have a specific, like, weird, like, narrative angle like they did with the Mako side of the story. It's fairly, like, accurate here. But it's boring for, like, the main character who actually has, like, a pretty big arc going on. It's like, this is all you have to say? And again, like, there's time here. Like, there's full bits of dialogue back and forth between Korra and Asami here. Why weren't they a little bit more direct with some of Asami's dialogue in terms of leaning in towards the relationship to further set it up? And that, like, there's a reason people were sort of confused by the ending, and it's because you didn't use moments like this to make it abundantly clear that there was a romantic connection between the two. As I said, like, it is kind of just rinse and repeat. It's, Korra, I did this bad thing, I'm terrible. Asami, like, no, you did this positive stuff. And that's it. Like, it's nice to get a recap of, like, all of the things that Korra has done. But it's very, like, okay, this is the plot. We saw it. It's not the same type of reflection. Like, okay, I get it. Like, it's very difficult to compare this to Embron and Players because Embron and Players had full animation. But the intent of Embron and Players, taking away the visuals, was for the team to see events from the past and reflect on them in an interesting way to cause things like Katara and Aang's dynamic, and Zuko being frustrated by what he sees, and so on. And Tenzin comes in, and immediately what he has to say feels like there's a little bit more to it. It's still sort of repetitive in regards to, like, he said stuff like this to Korra in book 3 already. But there's more impact to it because at this stage in the story, Korra's relationship with Tenzin is a better developed dynamic. And that speaks to the idea of, like, they had like 5, 6, 7, 8 lines of dialogue for Asami. And it was very plain dialogue. It didn't present that much unique in what was going on. And that was just a very quick section of recap, and we're done. Korra's just back to normal. Here we have Baraz and Anna. The Bolin side of the story obviously is fun because Varric tells most of the story, and it's like a humorous take on some of this stuff. But Bolin has actually, I think outside of Korra, had like the most development in the entire series. So I almost wish that there was a little bit more of a serious tone to this to get across how much she's done. Whereas as it is, it feels a little bit too much like it's just like using Varric to kind of big up Bolin, and it doesn't quite work as well as you think it should. There's a few nice little bits here that get across that Varric and Bolin actually do have a pretty good dynamic, that they're close, that like Varric tries to cheer Bolin up about the Opal situation and so on, and like this is Varric dealing with what's happened with Julie. Like there's options here, like where this plot is at this point in time, to just have a little bit more of a serious reflection with these two. It's probably just an example of, at times when they decide to go a little bit too far down the random path in Korra with the humor, or Avatar with the humor, they can just go way overboard with it. Now, thankfully, I think this more or less keeps it in line. It's not too much of a problem. But it's just an example of, like, what are the takeaways from this episode overall? In Book 4, the last book of Korra, what does this episode do that is like memorable when you get to the end of the season? Mako reflecting on his past, like, does that build to anything? No. The Korra section, like I said, was a little bit of just, let's have Korra kind of bring up issues she's sort of already dealt with, and Asami just kind of pat them down, and then Tenzin comes in, and like we're back to where we were at the start. Again, it doesn't really accomplish anything. So the only memorable parts of this episode are the sort of weird things here, the weird re-edits that they do here for the Varric story about Bolin. Beyond that, it's just, oh, Wu and Mako were doing some training. Asami and Korra were just in the same scene together. And then more plot focused is that Bolin and Varric are on their way back, of course. Like, this is pretty funny, just like all the villains just like, having a conference call with each other and just being really weird. Zombie Amon. At least there's some creativity, I think, in this section of it. And it's not just, let's have a really, like, over the top, like way too much focus on Mako and romance. The middle part is just like super by the numbers. This at least has creativity to it. In that, like, Varric's kind of mixing like Nook Tuk together with this, and then just weird plots. It is still a recap, but it's got a tone that, like, could be a little bit better. And yeah, you see Bolin being upset that, at this point there's issues between him and Opal. And Varric sort of changes the story here so that it works out better. And this is the thing here of like that because Varric is doing Bolin's story for him, it does end up being partial Varric backstory as well, which I suppose kind of works out okay because he and Julie are a bit more of a focus this season. And here we go. Here's the part of the story where like he gives Bolin his happy ending. She comes around. Airbender army. Terror Square. Like, it's just a crazy edit of like Varric being a wild director in the early days of Movers. Laser eyes. Bolin edited there onto Spirit Korra. But you wish they'd done a little bit more of like, showing Bolin save the president, that he's become a hero, and actually had a bit of reflection of like, Bolin has changed a lot. And they kind of let it just go wherever it needs to go here, of like just being weird. When like showing the various arcs that he's had of like becoming a lava bender in season 3. It would have been actually cool to see Bolin acknowledge him being a bit of a scaredy cat, always having to have like Mako save him, to where like he's done some incredible things over the course of the series. And yeah, here, don't overthink it. Never let the truth get in the way. Get in the way of a good story. And that's where we end. And look, it's fine. I don't think this episode is like terrible or even necessarily like bad. It's just aggressively average in a show that overall is not average. Korra, despite, I think most people agreeing it's not as good as Avatar, I still really think it's close, is a super high, well above average show that we don't get many of, which is why the Avatar universe is so important and so well done. This episode really does stand out as just not having really anything to it. Like I said, in an episode called Remembrances, what is actually memorable about this episode? And the only thing you can really say is some of the weird edit type things that they do in the Bolin section of the story. Because say what you will about like everyone reading into every single Korra Asami scene because Brian said to set up Korra Asami. There's nothing here. There's nothing here to read into on that side of things. It should have been better written, especially on Asami's side of things, to maybe lean more into romance. I think that would have actually been a nice little bit of a plot point to have here. Utilize this episode where you don't have a lot going on to touch on that more. And I think this is probably the episode that you most heavily look to as like, yeah, they really did leave it right until the end. They almost didn't ask. Like, they've said this, basically, Mike and Brian, that they only realized, like, right towards the end that they were going to let us do more than we thought we could. And they realized too late before, like, at that point, most of the episodes were done. And they couldn't go back to edit stuff in. And it's an episode like this where they probably should have tried to, put in a bit more to test ground on an episode that is kind of experimental. Like I said, the Mako part I think is only memorable for how poorly written it is, and just, in my mind, terrible it is. That it's just 8 minutes at the start of this episode that is just, honestly, for me, kind of hard to watch because of the approach they take to dealing with Mako. The middle part, to me, is just very, very average. It's just a couple of minutes of Korra and Asami talking, and then Tenzin comes in, and, like, there's nothing really to say about it. It's the Varric Bolin stuff is entertaining, but that's almost where you would wish that they actually should have done more of a straightforward recap for Bolin to more highlight his journey more than anything else. But that's this episode. Like, I don't see the point in, like, going particularly heavily in on criticizing it, but I also don't see the point in necessarily defending this episode much. It is what it is, and I think trying to say it's more than that is, I think, unnecessary. I'd never recommend, like, skipping this in a rewatch, because I think there's some value to it, like I said, but I think we just need to acknowledge that, yeah, it's bottom of the pile. There has to be one. And I don't think there's any case for other episodes being here. Like, the two episodes you'd maybe consider are, like, okay, Peacekeepers from Book 2. No, that has a plot of its own. It is its own full episode. It is part of the plot. It has stuff to it that you remember. And because of that, it is a better episode than this. The Great Divide from Avatar, similarly, is memorable. People remember The Great Divide. And so many aspects of it, because there are actually cool stuff in it. The Canyon Guide is an interesting character. The two tribes, interesting, nice location, new animal included in that. None of that is in this episode, and I think that's the main point to make. So yeah, they're my thoughts on the episode. In the comments, let me know what your thoughts are. But that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.